Welcome back. In this video I'm going to show you how to start creating glass materials. So here we are again in our course materials.blend file where we are creating our material library for use in the asset browser. And we have our scene and we want to now make a change to our scene. So at the moment we just have this plain background. What I want to do is I want to actually have an additional background that I can use for when I'm working with very reflective or transmissive materials, so I can get a better idea of what we're seeing through the material or what's bouncing off the material. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to create a new collection in the outliner. And with collection, I'm going to call this transmissive. We have our plain material. I'm going to duplicate this. I'm going to use Shift D to duplicate that. And now we have plane 001 in our collection. We're going to call this color plane. And you'll see why I'm calling it color plane in just a moment. I'm going to drag that into the transmissive folder. And let's turn off this original plane for the moment. So we're only seeing this second plane. And now we need to add a new material onto that. So at the moment we have material 001 on it. I'm going to turn that off and add a new material. And this is going to be called color plane. So this is just went pure white because we just have a pure white shader on it. Now what we do want to do is we want to create an image to go on this plane now. So I'm going to go to UV editing. And in this workspace we have our viewport on one side and our UV image editor on the other side. I don't need it quite that big, so let's make some more space here. Now the UV editing workspace will put you directly into edit mode, so I can just hit A and select all. And that will select my entire plane, and you can see that at the moment this is the unwrap on this object. You can see that we have a large face here and then we have quite a skinny face here, whereas both these faces are around about the same size, so we know something's off on our unwrap. So we're going to hit U in the viewport and we're just going to do a simple unwrap. And that will flatten out our plane a lot better and get rid of any stretching. The next thing that we want to do is we want to actually create an image that we can use on our object. In this case, I'm actually just going to do it straight within the UV editor by hitting New. And I'm going to change this width to 2048 and the height to 2048, just so we have a slightly higher resolution background image. I'm going to call it BKG for background, and within generated type, I'm going to go to color grid. Then I'll hit OK, and this creates this image. So now we have this massive grid of different colors, checkers, and letters that we can use in our scene. So again, we're going to go back to our procedural shading vertical window. We have our image there. Let's look through the camera. And at the moment we have this plain white background. And let's plug in this image texture. So where do we find that image texture? Well, it's pretty easy. We can use Shift A and go to texture and then down to image texture. And within this image texture we can just grab this output, plug it into base color, and at the moment we don't get any result because we don't have an image selected. Now if you have an image on your hard drive that you'd like to use, you can open it from here and that will take you into a file browser and you can find whichever image you want. But since we already have that background image that we just created, we can select it from this drop down box and plug it in there. Now at the moment this background is rotated 90 degrees, so we would like to fix that. Now a lot of people would probably go back to UV editing, select all this and start rotating it the same way that you would in any other software. But I think this is a good opportunity to introduce you to another new node that we're going to continue to use, and that's the texture coordinate node. Now since we have Node Wrangler enabled, we can create one incredibly quickly. Anytime you have an image or a node that has a vector input, we can use Ctrl T and click on that and it will automatically create a texture coordinate node and a mapping node. So in this case we are using the UVs because we've just unwrapped our object, we've flattened it out. If we were to use generated, you would see that we get a lot of stretching in one direction. If we use object, again, you can see we're getting a lot of stretching, a lot of issues. We have camera mapping mode, which in some cases is going to work pretty fine. Window mode, reflection mode, which is very weird, and normal mode, which is even weirder. For our purposes, we're going to stick with UV, but we do want to rotate the image around. So the way we're going to do that is, if you imagine looking down at a flat piece of paper on your desk, if it's rotated in this orientation, so the top is to the left hand side and the right hand side has the bottom of the image, you would rotate it 90 degrees clockwise, and that's what we're going to do here. So within rotation, we're going to look at the z-axis. Remember, the z-axis is up. We are going to rotate that 90 degrees, and that will fix our image. If we want, we could change the location of our image by scrolling this along. I'm going to keep that at 0. We could also scale our image, so if we wanted to make it bigger or smaller, we could click and drag through all 3 options and just type in a different scale. In this case, let's go with 0.5. Actually, I think that might be a little bit big. Let's just go back to 1. And I think I'm quite happy with that just now. The other thing that we might want to do is we might want to change the roughness on this so the ground isn't reflective. And now we have a background that we can use for when we're working with transmissive or highly reflective materials, and that will give us a better indication of the surface characteristics of the shader we're creating. So let's get on to making this glass shader. Now, if we are using cycles, glass shaders are incredibly easy. So I'm going to select this object. I'm going to remove the material that's on it, hit new, and we're just going to call this glass. And this is just going to be your most simple glass shader. We are also going to change over from Eevee to cycles because glass works in a completely different way in both of these renderers. So you'll remember that in Material Preview, by default, Blender uses the Eevee render engine, which means it's not using path tracing, it's faking a lot of things, like it can fake ambient occlusion and depth of field, whereas Cycles will actually calculate it. That's why Cycles renders take a lot longer, and you usually need more samples to get a cleaner render. So at the moment we're in Cycles, we're going to change one setting in this, which is transmission, and we're going to increase it all the way up. And we start to see something happening. We start to see the colour of the background coming through, but our surface is too rough. So just like we get very diffuse reflections, this prevents a lot of transmission through our material. So we're going to decrease this roughness, and you can see that's cleaning up quite nicely. We're starting to see through our object, and we can actually see the background coming through. And just like when you look in the bowl of a spoon, your face ends up upside down because the bottom of the spoon reflects the top of your face, and the top of the spoon reflects the bottom of your face. The refractions through this glass sphere do the same. We start to see the bottom of the background at the top of the sphere and the top of the background at the bottom of the sphere. So we know our index of refraction is working correctly. So with our roughness turned down a little bit, let's take it to about 0.04 or so. We're getting a nice reflection on the surface of our object. If we want it to be less transmissive, we can increase the transmission roughness of our shader, and that blurs out the refractions coming through. So we still have those sharp reflections on the surface of our object, but any light going through the object starts to blur out. Let's turn that transmission roughness all the way back down. Now, just a quick note, if you are doing a glass object in Eevee, this is the result you'll get. Now, if I go into Material Preview, I'm not going to get any good result at all. The better option is to change your render back to render mode and change your renderer to Eevee. And again, we can see the same result in both of these, but we do have an option now to make some changes. So we can go down to Screen Space Reflections and turn that on. We can turn on Refraction too. And the final setting that we have to do is within our object and our material settings. We scroll all the way down. Under Settings, we have a couple of options for Blend Mode and Shadow Mode. and screen space refraction. So first of all, I'm going to turn that on and we start to see our refraction. And within blend mode, we can also change to something like alpha hashed. So it doesn't look as good as Cycles. It's not as accurate. If we go back to Cycles, we can see we get a much different result there, a much more accurate result. And that's the reason that we are sticking with Cycles for the vast majority of this course. Okay, so it's challenge time. So your challenge in this video is to create one or more objects in your scene and apply the glass shader to them. Now you can choose any object you want. You can stick with a sphere, you can use cubes, cylinders, toruses. You can do something a little bit more complex if you want to. You could even add modifiers to those objects to create some beveled edges, to add subdivision surface to make your object even smoother. Just remember to add auto smooth or smooth shading to your object so you don't get facets on your final render. And also make sure to mark your shader as an asset so you don't lose that, and save your file. So pause the video, have a go at that challenge, and join me in a moment and I'll show you the result I came up with. Okay, welcome back. So I hope you had fun playing around with the glass material. This is the result I came up with, and I wanted to show you at this stage because you can see there are a few issues with it. So I have used the Suzanne monkey head and I've also added a subdivision surface to it, but I can see my surface is still very faceted. So always remember to add that shade smooth, especially if you're doing something like a glass, because you're not really going to have any sharp edges unless you're doing something like a diamond or crystal where you specifically need very sharp edges and flat planes. You always want to be shading smooth. So you can see that on this object we have some really nice refractions and reflections on our surface. And on the surface of this brushed aluminum cube, we also start to see some caustic reflections as well. Cycles has got much better at doing this kind of thing recently. And because of that, you can make some really nice looking glass textures and shaders that render very, very fast. In fact, let's do a very quick render here. So we are going to change a couple of settings here. So in light paths, I'm going to show you what happens if we take our transmission down. Let's take our transmission down to 1. And you can see that this no longer looks like glass. We can only see through one side of the object. If we add in one more transmission value, it looks a bit better, but we still get some black areas. And let's click and drag this up a little bit more, and you start to see as we do that, we get more black areas disappearing. Yeah, about 15 is the magic number for this particular object. If we actually turn down glossy reflections as well, you can see that the same thing happens. Now this looks like very early 2000s glass to me because we don't have any glossy reflections. Let's increase those up a little bit until all the black areas disappear. So let's take that again. I think maybe the magic number for that is also going to be around about 15. Let's make sure our caustic reflections and refractions are turned on. Let's do a very quick render. Okay, so the render is chugging away there. It's taken a little bit longer than I thought it would, and I think the reason for that is the caustics are getting very expensive on the GPU just because of the complexity of the material and of the model itself and the light bouncing around the scene. Plus all those transmissive and glossy reflections all have to be calculated, so there's maybe some more bounces in this scene than is probably strictly needed. But it's better to use too many bounces than too few when working with transmission and glossiness. So join me in the next video, and again we're going to continue to work through that principled BSDF node, looking at some of the different settings, and we'll even introduce you to even more new nodes.